If you haven't seen the video covering Part 1 of this game, don't be surprised when I spoil it and Part 2 in this video. Honkai Impact 3rd, Part the 2nd, is a game where yo-yos are both melee weapons and a mode of transportation, where shadows are a tangible material that can be fashioned into literally anything as long as you play enough Five Nights at Freddy's, and where literally none of this matters. You'll see why soon enough. So join me as I tell you why Honkai Impact 3rd Part 2 is an absolute disaster. Right off the bat, I want to preface this review with a bit of context, specifically how Part 2 was marketed. Those of you who saw my review of Part 1 may know that the main story of this game requires a little bit of a time requirement. This is why it made sense to me that Hoyo began marketing Part 2 as a soft reboot of sorts. With a fresh new cast of characters set on a new planet, it was the perfect opportunity to reset the stakes while still exploring the Honkaiverse. This isn't just me talking out of my butt, they really did push the launch of Part 2 as an entry point into the world of Honkai Impact 3rd for new players. Whenever they sponsored streamers to play the game, they'd always start right off from the beginning of Part 2, which should mean that the story doesn't require any prior knowledge in order to enjoy it, right? It doesn't require any prior knowledge to enjoy it, right? This was Hoyo's first massive mistake. Not only does the game require you to grind up a new account to level 30 in order to even access Part 2 at all, but the entire plotline of Part 2 makes absolutely no sense if you don't know the story of Part 1. And I'm not talking, oh, you need to know the basics. The story of Part 2 directly hinges on deep lore that wasn't revealed in the main story until something like 50 or 60 hours in. You play as the Dream Seeker, a walking wardrobe malfunction who, upon taking a nap in her apartment, gets rizzed up by a redhead named Senadina who stole Elysia's fit. Then you wake up a second time and are told by two Shixel Valkyries that they just dug you and Senna out of a stone that they found in a special area of the Quantum Sea known as the Sea of Data. How did they wind up there? Heck if I know. The Dream Seeker then explains that she comes from a nearby bubble world called Ogia, which is a city that used to be on Mars before the Cocoon of Finality curb-stomped it and it fell into the Sea of Quanta. Alright, so let's pause here and take stock. In the first 15 minutes of Part 2's story, we've already had such concepts as Shixel, the Sea of Quanta, and the Cocoon of Finality show up, all without any kind of explanation. Not to mention things like the significance of Senadina's dress in that dance sequence would be completely lost on new players too. Now, an organization like Shixel is simple enough that you could probably get away with explaining it in a few lines of dialogue. But the Sea of Quanta and the Cocoon of Finality? Those had entire story arcs dedicated to what they were and how they worked. And they also don't show up until midway and at the very end of Part 1, respectively. At best, immediately hinging the plot on these things is a massive spoiler for Part 1. And more importantly, what it more likely does is just confuse new players for essentially no reason. While I don't think it's impossible to set up the story of Part 2 in a way that is digestible for new players, the problem is they didn't do that. The dialogue also falls into the same pitfall that a lot of the worst bits of Part 1 fell into as well. Namely, tons of exposition and info dumping on specific world-building mechanics that contribute little to the overall plot. That's not to say there aren't interesting ideas in here, it's just the execution is absolutely abysmal and is either boring or confusing. Sometimes both at the same time. Helia and Coralie, the Shixel Valkyries I mentioned earlier, also feel like they're only here to occasionally make a comment connecting Part 2's world building with something from Part 1. Instead of the Honkai disaster, we have the Shadow Calamity. Instead of harnessing Honkai energy, we instead use fear to harvest shadows. Instead of Herrscher authorities, we have the Astral Ring. You get the idea. In general, the main cast lacks a lot of the charm that the characters from Part 1 had, mainly because they feel less like characters and more like vehicles for exposition dumps. We learn about the 7 shoes of Langqiu, who seemed like they were made to be the Mars equivalent of the Flame Chasers from Part 1, just without any of the characterization that made the Flame Chasers interesting. We witnessed their struggles to preserve these bubble worlds from the impending shadow calamity, and eventually they all come together and use the power of the Astral Ring to make a god just so they can then kill it. It took ages, but this story arc's conclusion felt like Part 2 was finally starting to get on track, and that's when everything fell apart. Up until this point, the game has spent literal hours just yammering on and on about the world building, only to then say, forget all of that, everything you know is fake and made up. Out of the blue, the Dream Seeker finds Vita shaking her awake, and she explains that everything she experienced up until this point was all a simulation. As it turns out, Mars is a quantum supercomputer, and the Dream Seeker is a program designed to re-experience the final events of Mars civilization, or something. That's right, Honkai 3rd is ripping off the Fate franchise, again. The Shixel Valkyries we met put the Dream Seeker aboard the Hyperion and brought her back to the Moth Moon base for further studying. In reality, the Dream Seeker gets to meet other characters from Part 1, and she's relieved to find out that Helia and Coralie were real people. The same, however, can't be said of Senadina. Apparently, the Dream Seeker just kinda made her up. We go back into the simulation only to find that everything has changed. Friends are now foes. The Seven Shoes now have backstories that change wildly multiple times. And really, quite honestly, this entire sequence is just Teresa and the Dream Seeker aimlessly wandering about until Vita literally gets so bored she starts the apocalypse. Oh, also, when Part 2 launched, there was an option to play as a male version of the Dream Seeker, who quite frankly had a way better design than the female version. But apparently Honkai 3rd players are so allergic to playable male characters that he literally got deleted from the game, both in gameplay and in universe. Props to the devs for finding the absolute funniest way to retcon a character out of existence, I guess. Only time will tell if they manage to get the plot of Part 2 to a better place, but as of right now, whatever they're trying to cook is about to burn down the entire kitchen. There was technically a small amount of foreshadowing leading up to the "it was all a simulation" twist, but that just makes it worse in my opinion. Think about it, if this was the plan all along, then why spend literal hours building up the world and exposition dumping about these characters' backstories, only to rug pull it and then make it clear that there is absolutely no reason for you to get invested in them? Anyone from Mars that isn't the Dream Seeker can have literally anything about them change arbitrarily at any time, for any reason. And none of the world building matters because none of it is real. It's hard to even have a sense of what the stakes are because all we have to go on is that the simulation is linked to Kiana falling into a coma or something. It all just feels like they saw whatever they were originally going for was received poorly, so they're backpedaling like crazy and abandoning any pretense of this being a fresh starting point for new players, and instead roping in Part 1 characters back in to regain interest in the plot. While it is intriguing that they are starting to incorporate parts of the lore first introduced in Star Rail into the main plot of Impact 3rd, they're doing it in a way that basically expects that you're already keeping up with Star Rail, whether it's by playing it yourself or watching lore recaps on YouTube. They somehow had the easiest and most natural way to introduce these concepts to the audience, because the characters are encountering these things for themselves for the first time, and managed to goof that up too. And if you think the Honkai crossover would save it, think again. I'm probably going to sound like a broken record here, because this isn't the first time I've complained about a botched crossover event in a gacha game on this channel. However, this time I would argue it's even worse because the two properties crossing over are owned by the same company. Heck, they're already explicitly set in the same universe because Star Rail is a spin-off of Impact 3rd. They've been hyping this up for months, with multiple high-effort trailers put out on the channels for both games. So, what exactly did they mess up? Well, for starters, 95% of what happens in it isn't canon. The appeal of a crossover is seeing worlds collide. We want to see how characters react to meeting each other, what kind of shenanigans they get into, and maybe even leave the ordeal slightly changed. Now, due to licensing issues in the real world, it's easy to see why most crossovers tend to be the video game equivalent of a bottle episode. Because the property temporarily crossing over can't be referred to in the future, it can't really have a lasting effect on the status quo. This is where the Honkai crossover could have immediately stood out. These characters are quite literally in the same universe and are made by the same company, so there should be no obstacles to this crossover having lasting effects on the game. In theory, Earth and the Honkaiverse encountering aliens from beyond the solar system should be a world-shattering event. But you want to know how much the crossover affects the main story? Sparkle shows up out of nowhere, recruits Vita into the Masked Fools, and also a memo keeper is talking to Kiana while she's in the coma. That's it.
Epic rap battles of history. Hydrogen bomb versus coughing baby. Begin.
The actual story of the crossover event itself is a bottle episode that isn't canon until the very end, where they try to give it stakes by implying it could have had a massive effect on the main story, but you save the day so it has a net zero effect overall. It may as well never have happened. Don't get me wrong, there are some fun moments in it, such as Einstein briefly parodying Pokemon, or a confrontation with Welt turning into a Super Robot Wars reference. But in general, we hardly even get to see the characters interact with each other, and the entire thing is made up of largely recycled assets. Which may sound like a strange complaint, because yeah, of course it's going to be made of reused assets. But you see, the problem is, it's made of recycled Impact 3rd assets, not Star Rail assets. They used the Honkai 3rd versions of these characters as stand-ins for the Star Rail ones, and every time they did it, it immediately killed any immersion or enthusiasm I had for the crossover. Oh, well, we couldn't have possibly used Bronya Rand for this part because of my brother in Gacha. You made the Bronya Rand. Any combat that happens takes place in Honkai 3rd battle arenas, which is mind-boggling to me because Star Rail has combat arena environments too. The main story of the event doesn't even have full voice acting, and swaps between being silent and being voiced seemingly at random. Keep in mind, this is a game that still makes literal tens of millions of dollars, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. Why does it feel like they cheaped out on their own crossover? If it was a time constraint issue, then they should have just let the team cook a little longer. This is something that could have drawn both sides of the fandom together in celebration of the rich cast of characters and expansive lore that they've established in the Honkaiverse, and instead, it's just a massive disappointment. I will say though, whatever team was in charge of making Sparkle's kit, absolutely cooked. She actually uses the revolver. She does so much trolling, she uses the Star Rail UI when she ults.
I gotta tell you, it was perfect. Perfect. Everything, down to the last minute details.
So, whichever devs were in charge of her kit, keep up the good work. Everyone else should be ashamed to have squandered the opportunity the crossover presented. Before we move on, a quick word from the sponsor of this video, AnimeDakimakuraPillow.com. You might remember them from last year's review of Nikkei. Has it seriously been a year since then? Jeez, my upload schedule has gotten glacial. Anyways, this time they sent me a pillow cover of Toki from Blue Archive, and La Creatura. Why a Blue Archive character? Call it foreshadowing. Why Toki specifically? I am just a really big fan of Yui Ishikawa. For full disclosure, they sent me these two covers for free in exchange for my honest review of their products. And I have to say, I'm glad I chose the two-way tricot material for the Toki cover. Not that the Neko art cover is bad, but the fabric for Toki's cover is a noticeable step up in quality, with it generally being softer and less prone to wrinkling, it seems. The print quality on both is fantastic. There doesn't seem to be any bleeding colors or misaligned bits, which gives it a crisp appearance overall. Included with the sponsored order is a drawstring bag and a keychain of What's Her Bucket from Demon Slayer, which is pretty neat. The order itself arrived about 2 weeks after it shipped, which, given that it's prime holiday season right now, is pretty decent. Anyhow, if you want more of an idea of the kinds of goods you can pick up from AnimeDakimakuraPillow.com, you could also refer to the previous review I did in my Nikkei video. And if you're thinking of picking up anything from their website, they've got a Christmas sale going on right now until January 1st. You can use the code ADP-VERM for 10% off any order, or if you spend $150 or more, you can use the code shown on screen for a bigger discount. Thanks once again to AnimeDakimakuraPillow.com for sponsoring this video. Now back to Honkai Impact 3rd Part 2. Alright, so the writing is really bad, but the gameplay is still good, right? The gameplay is still good, right? Alright, I'm gonna say it. Part 2's gameplay is too much of a mixed bag to be considered good. The first and biggest issue is that, quite frankly, power creep has gotten completely out of control. Part 2 characters are so much more powerful than Part 1 characters that there is now literally no point in investing in anything but Part 2 characters, with one exception at time of writing.
It's so sad that Kevin died of Ligma.
Who the heck is Kevin?
Ligma balls!
There may be a few niche holdouts for the moment, but let's be real, they too will eventually be replaced by a Part 2 character. This means that pretty much everything players have spent building, up to the launch of Part 2, is now completely worthless. The changes they made to the gacha is interesting, but on a macro level, I consider it to be at best a side grade rather than a straight improvement. Before, you had to pull gacha for a Valkyrie Stigmata, but now, they're all craftable. But there's a catch. Now you have to pull for a Valkyrie signature weapon, because otherwise, you'll be missing out on nearly half of their damage. Any craftable or free alternatives are, quite frankly, a waste of resources. And since you pretty much always get a full set of their Stigmata in the process of pulling for their weapon, effectively nothing changes. And being able to craft a missing Stigmata is just there in case you really get screwed by RNG. To Hoyo's credit, at least there isn't any 50-50 or 75-25 nonsense on banners. The S rank is always the featured character or weapon. They even lowered the amount it takes to get to pity, but with no corresponding boost to soft pity, so while you may only need 90 pulls to guarantee a character, the downside is you'll pretty much always need around 90 rolls to get a character, barring extreme luck. I will have to note that overall Part 2 gacha is significantly cheaper than before. Heck, I stopped spending on the game since Part 2 dropped entirely, and so far I've been able to pull every character I've wanted and their weapon through the power of absolutely not giving a crap about Thelema or Sleepy Terry. While Part 2 gacha is much friendlier to low spenders or free-to-play players, since all Part 2 Valkyries essentially function as both a main DPS and a support for other Part 2 Valkyries, making it so that you only need 4 core units to cover most scenarios in the game, I still can't help but factor in that this came at the cost of absolutely obliterating any value Part 1 characters could bring to your account, making things like the War Treasury and most farmable Valkyries pointless beyond getting some extra crystals from the Elysian Realm. Not to mention that with power creep this crazy, it really begs the question of how long it will take before these Part 2 Valkyries will get outmoded by some shiny new character. And while it certainly is cheaper to keep up with Part 2 gacha compared to Part 1, it's still by no means cheap. The Honkai 3rd equivalent of Welkin, which is to say the $5 premium login pass, gives a hilariously low amount of crystals. The Battle Pass also offers a lot less value to players now because it only gives out Part 1 Valkyries and their gear, which means it's really only for those who want to fill out their collection at this point. It's for those very reasons why I've completely eliminated spending on this game. It simply isn't worth it. TLDR, the reason why I consider Part 2 gacha to be a side grade rather than a straight upgrade is because the characters you get from it have so much power creep that they are essentially mandatory, and eliminate almost all value the legacy characters add to one's account. As for the actual combat and exploration and whatnot, it's just a post-Honkai Odyssey Part 2 with a minor reskin. Instead of the Moon Ring, we now have the Astral Ring. You go around a super cramped, open world map and do some of the most mediocre puzzles I've experienced in a video game to progress the exploration. While the combat is still relatively fun, the overall experience of Honkai Impact 3rd at the launch of Part 2 was that of ever-increasing tedium. Now, on top of all the other crap that I mentioned in my previous video, they expected us to do additional chores such as Part 2 specific daily quests and weekly boss fights. Oh yeah, and they also deleted the co-op mode that was so dead I didn't even bother to mention it in my previous video, and instead replaced it with a bunch of gimmicky trial character stages, which are mandatory if you want to get the resources needed to upgrade your weapons all the way. This meant that while they technically increased the amount of resources you can get in a week, it also meant even more crap I had to slog through on a weekly basis because I could now no longer afford to ignore it. They even added Genshin-style artifacts to the open world mode. Keep in mind that while Honkai 3rd was only getting more busy work, pretty much all other major gacha games, especially Hoyo games, were rolling out massive quality of life improvements that made keeping up with the game easier. It wasn't until 5 months after Part 2 initially dropped that we finally started to see big upgrades such as auto-dispatching dorm errands, which in addition to being long overdue, some still don't take it far enough in my opinion. For example, the Elysian Realm Light should pretty much just skip all non-boss combat at this point. If you can't fail, then I'm not interested, it's filler. While the quality of life additions certainly have made playing the game much less of a headache, I'm gonna be real with you, I'm out. Everything they're doing for the quality of life feels like a band-aid on a gaping bullet wound. Hoyo committed the one cardinal sin a gacha game can rarely ever recover from in my mind, making me regret spending money on it. And with the direction the story is going, and they're doubling down on the absolutely atrocious open world maps, there is no longer any redeeming factor keeping my interest. Oh well, at least the soundtrack is still decent. If I were able to speak to the developers directly and give my 2 cents, it would be this. Get rid of whoever the current story writer is, and get someone who can do good, character-focused narratives. Honkai 3rd shined brightest when the world building and backstory was there to enhance the characters, not be the sole focus. Stop it with the pseudoscience word salads and just focus on emotional character arcs. Give us a reason to care about the 7 Shoes. Because right now, the only 2 I care about are Songche and Lantern, and that's just because I find them hot. Next, get rid of Elysian Realm. It's boring and can be brute forced by pretty much any Part 2 Valkyrie on the highest difficulty now. In universe, it's been deleted outright for multiple years now, so just add a new roguelike mode that has a fresh spin to the formula that gives you the same weekly progress. Star Rail did it with the Sim Universe spin-off modes, so the groundwork is already there for Honkai 3rd. Also, while we're at it, knock it off with the crappy open world maps. If I want to play an open world gacha game, I'll play Genshin or Wuthering Waves. There really isn't anything Honkai 3rd can do to truly compete with those 2, so instead, lean into what makes Honkai 3rd fun, namely stage-based hack-and-slash fights with flashy animations and fun combos. And finally, in an ideal world, I would give the other prominent Part 1 Valkyries the same treatment they're doing for Finality Kiana. That is, give them something that makes them compatible with the Astral Ring so they're worth investing in again. Heck, I'd even go so far as to make these new weapons be craftable, as a way to make it up to those who are willing to remain loyal to the game even when all of the stuff they paid money for became worthless. So, there you have it. What was once the title that gave Hoyoverse the means to become the juggernaut that they are today, now is a game that has managed to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. While not entirely unrecoverable, the absolute nosedive in the quality of the writing, along with the continued hyperfixation on adding mediocre open-world gameplay instead of memorable and fun hack-and-slash combat stages, do not inspire confidence in me that the game will return to the heights it experienced in its prime. I hope you all now know why Honkai Impact 3rd Part 2 is an absolute disaster.